Abe Lincoln's Anecdotes and Stories by R.D. Wordsworth, Part 4. The Presidential Chinfly. Some of Mr. Lincoln's intimate friends once called his attention to a certain member of his cabinet who was quietly working to secure a nomination for the presidency. Although knowing that Mr. Lincoln was to be a candidate for re-election, his friends insisted that the cabinet officer ought to be made to give up his presidential aspirations or be removed from office. The situation reminded Mr. Lincoln of a story. "My brother and I," he said, "were once plowing corn, I driving the horse and he holding the plow. The horse was lazy, but on one occasion he rushed across the field so that I, with my long legs, could scarcely keep pace with him. On reaching the end of the furrow, I found an enormous chinfly fastened upon him and knocked him off. My brother asked me what I did that for. I told him I didn't want the old horse bitten in that way. 'Why,' said my brother, 'that's all that made him go.' 'Now,' said Mr. Lincoln, 'if Mr. Blank has a presidential chinfly biting him, I'm not going to knock him off if it will only make his department go.'" Webster couldn't have done more. Lincoln got even with the Illinois Central Railroad Company in 1855 in a most substantial way, at the same time secured sweet revenge for an insult, unwarranted in every way, put upon him by one of the officials of that corporation. Lincoln and Herndon defended the Illinois Central Railroad in an action brought by McLean County, Illinois, in August 1853, to recover taxes alleged to be due the county from the road. The legislature had granted the road immunity from taxation, and this was a case intended to test the constitutionality of the law. The road sent a retainer fee of $250. In the lower court, the case was decided in favor of the railroad. An appeal to the Supreme Court followed, was argued twice, and finally decided in favor of the road. This last decision was rendered sometime in 1855. Lincoln then went to Chicago and presented the bill for legal services. Lincoln and Herndon only asked for $2,000 more. The official to whom he was referred, after looking at the bill, expressed great surprise. "Why, sir," he exclaimed, "this is as much as Daniel Webster himself would have charged. We cannot allow such a claim." "Why not?" asked Lincoln. "We could have hired first-class lawyers at that figure," was the response. "We won the case, didn't we?" queried Lincoln. "Certainly," replied the official. "Daniel Webster, then," retorted Lincoln in no amiable tone, "couldn't have done more," and Abe walked out of the official's office. Lincoln withdrew the bill and started for home. On the way he stopped at Bloomington, where he met Grant Goodrich, Archibald Williams, Norman B. Judd, O.H. Browning, and other attorneys who, on learning of his modest charge for the valuable services rendered the railroad, induced him to increase the demand to $5,000 and to bring suit for that sum. This was done at once. On the trial, 6 lawyers certified that the bill was reasonable, and judgment for that sum went by default. The judgment was promptly paid, and, of course, his partner Herndon got "your half, Billy," without delay. Long and short of it. On the occasion of a serenade, the president was called for by the crowd assembled. He appeared at a window with his wife, who was somewhat below the medium height, and made the following brief remarks. "Here I am, and here is Mrs. Lincoln. That's the long and the short of it." Squire Bagley's Precedent. Mr. T.W.S. Kidd of Springfield says that he once heard a lawyer opposed to Lincoln trying to convince a jury that precedent was superior to law, and that custom made things legal in all cases. When Lincoln arose to answer him, he told the jury he would argue his case in the same way. Old Squire Bagley from Menard came into my office and said, "Lincoln, I want your advice as a lawyer. Has a man what's been elected justice of the peace a right to issue a marriage license?" I told him he had not, when the old squire threw himself back in his chair very indignantly and said, "Lincoln, I thought you was a lawyer. Now Bob Thomas and me had a bet on this thing, and we agreed to let you decide. But if this is your opinion, I don't want it, for I know a thunderin' sight better, for I have been squire now for 8 years, and have done it all the time." Tom Corwin's latest story. One of Mr. Lincoln's warm friends was Dr. Robert Bowl of Lakeland, Illinois. Telling of a visit he paid to the White House soon after Mr. Lincoln's inauguration, he said, "I found him the same Lincoln as a struggling lawyer and politician that I did in Washington as President of the United States, yet there was a dignity and self-possession about him in his high official authority. I paid him a second call in the evening. He had thrown off his reserve somewhat, and would walk up and down the room with his hands to his sides and laugh at the joke he was telling, or at one that was told to him. I remember one story he told to me on this occasion. Tom Corwin of Ohio had been down to Alexandria, Virginia that day, and had come back and told Lincoln a story which pleased him so much that he broke out in a hearty laugh and said, "I must tell you Tom Corwin's latest. Tom met an old man at Alexandria who knew George Washington, and he told Tom that George Washington often swore. Now, Corwin's father had always held the father of our country up as a faultless person, and told his son to follow in his footsteps. Well," said Corwin, "when I heard that George Washington was addicted to the vices and infirmities of man, I felt so relieved that I just shouted for joy." The cabinet was a settin'. Being in Washington one day, the Reverend Robert Collyer thought he'd take a look around. In passing through the grounds surrounding the White House, he cast a glance toward the presidential residence, and was astonished to see 3 pairs of feet resting on the ledge of an open window in one of the apartments of the second story. The divine paused for a moment, calmly surveyed the unique spectacle, and then resumed his walk toward the War Department. Seeing a laborer at work not far from the Executive Mansion, Mr. Collyer asked him what it all meant. To whom did the feet belong, and particularly the mammoth ones? "You old fool," answered the workman, "that's the cabinet, which is a settin', and them thar big feet belongs to old Abe." Massa Lincoln liked the Lord. By the act of emancipation, President Lincoln built for himself forever the first place in the affections of the African race in this country. The love and reverence manifested for him by many of these people has, on some occasions, almost reached adoration. One day Colonel McKay of New York, who had been one of a committee to investigate the condition of the freedmen upon his return from Hilton Head and Beaufort, called upon the President, and in the course of the interview said that up to the time of their arrival among them in the South of the Union forces, they had no knowledge of any other power. Their masters fled upon the approach of our soldiers, and this gave the slaves the conception of a power greater than their masters exercised. This power they called Massa Linkum. Colonel McKay said their place of worship was a large building they called the Praise House, and the leader of the meeting, a venerable black man, was known as the Praise Man. On a certain day, when there was quite a large gathering of the people, considerable confusion was created by different persons attempting to tell who and what Massa Linkum was. In the midst of the excitement, the white-headed leader commanded silence. "Brethren," said he, "you don't know nosin' what you're talking about. Now you just listen to me. Massa Linkum, he ebbery war. He know ebbery thing." Then, solemnly looking up, he added, "He walk the earth like the Lord." A bullet through his hat. A soldier tells the following story of an attempt upon the life of Mr. Lincoln. One night I was doing sentinel duty at the entrance to the Soldiers' Home. This was about the middle of August, 1864. About 11 o'clock I heard a rifle shot in the direction of the city, and shortly afterwards I heard approaching hoofbeats. In 2 or 3 minutes a horse came dashing up. I recognized the belated president. The president was bareheaded. The president simply thought his horse had taken fright at the discharge of the firearms. On going back to the place where the shot had been heard, we found the president's hat. It was a plain silk hat, and upon examination we discovered a bullet hole through the crown. The next day, upon receiving the hat, the president remarked that it was made by some foolish marksman and was not intended for him, but added that he wished nothing said about the matter. The president said philosophically, "I long ago made up my mind that if anybody wants to kill me, he will do it. Besides, in this case, it seems to me, the man who would succeed me would be just as objectionable to my enemies, if I have any." One dark night, as he was going out with a friend, he took along a heavy cane, remarking good-naturedly, Mother, Mrs. Lincoln, has got a notion into her head that I shall be assassinated, and to please her I take a cane when I go over to the War Department at night, when I don't forget it." The general was headed in. A Union general, operating with his command in West Virginia, allowed himself and his men to be trapped, and it was feared his force would be captured by the Confederates. The President heard the report read by the operator as it came over the wire, and remarked, "Once there was a man out West who was heading a barrel, as they used to call it. He worked like a good fellow in driving down the hoops, but just about the time he thought he had the job done, the head would fall in. Then he had to do the work all over again. All at once a bright idea entered his brain, and he wondered how it was he hadn't figured it out before. His boy, a bright, smart lad, was standing by, very much interested in the business, and lifting the young one up, he put him inside the barrel, telling him to hold the head in its proper place, while he pounded down the hoops on the sides. This worked like a charm, and he soon had the heading done. Then he realized that his boy was inside the barrel, and how to get him out he couldn't for his life figure out. General Blank is now inside the barrel, headed in, and the job now is to get him out." Mixing and mingling. An Eastern newspaper writer told how Lincoln, after his first nomination, received callers, the majority of them at his law office. While talking to 2 or 3 gentlemen and standing up, a very hard-looking customer rolled in and tumbled into the only vacant chair, and the one lately occupied by Mr. Lincoln. Mr. Lincoln's keen eye took in the fact, but gave no evidence of the notice. Turning around at last, he spoke to the odd specimen, holding out his hand at such a distance that our friend had to vacate the chair if he accepted the preferred shake. Mr. Lincoln quietly resumed his chair. It was a small matter, yet one giving proof more positively than a larger event of that peculiar way the man has of mingling with a mixed crowd. Wanted to burn him down to the stump. Preston King once introduced A.J. Bleecker to the President, and the latter, being an applicant for office, was about to hand Mr. Lincoln his vouchers when he was asked to read them. Bleecker had not read very far when the President disconcerted him by the exclamation, "Stop a minute. You remind me exactly of the man who killed the dog. In fact, you are just like him." "In what respect?" asked Bleecker, not feeling he had received a compliment. "Well," replied the President, "this man had made up his mind to kill his dog, an ugly brute, and proceeded to knock out his brains with a club. He continued striking the dog after the latter was dead, until a friend protested, exclaiming, 'You needn't strike him any more. The dog is dead. You killed him at the first blow.' 'Oh, yes,' said he, 'I know that, but I believe in punishment after death. So I see, do you.'" Bleecker acknowledged it was possible to overdo a good thing, and then came back at the President with an anecdote of a good priest who converted an Indian from heathenism to Christianity. The only difficulty he had with him was to get him to pray for his enemies. "This Indian had been taught to overcome and destroy all his friends he didn't like," said Bleecker, but the priest told him that while that might be the Indian method, it was not the doctrine of Christianity of the Bible. "St. Paul distinctly says," the priest told him, "'If thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink.'" The Indian shook his head at this, but when the priest added, "For in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head," poor Lowell was overcome with emotion, fell on his knees, and with outstretched hands and uplifted eyes invoked all sorts of blessings on the heads of all his enemies, supplicating for pleasant hunting grounds, a large supply of squaws, lots of papooses, and all other Indian comforts. Finally the good priest interrupted him, "As you did me, Mr. President," exclaiming, "Stop, my son, you have discharged your Christian duty, and have done more than enough." "Oh, no, Father," replied the Indian, "let me pray. I want to burn him down to the stump." Challenged all comers. Personal encounters were of frequent occurrence in Gentryville in early days, and the prestige of having thrashed an opponent gave the victor marked social distinction. Greenby Taylor, with whom Abe worked the greater part of one winter on a farm, furnished an account of the noted fight between John Johnston, Abe's stepbrother, and William Grigsby, in which stirring drama Abe himself played an important role before the curtain was rung down. Taylor's father was a second for Johnston, and William Whitton officiated in a similar capacity for Grigsby. They had a terrible fight, related Taylor, and it soon became apparent that Grigsby was too much for Lincoln's man, Johnston. After they had fought a long time without interference, it having been agreed not to break the ring, Abe burst through, caught Grigsby, threw him off and some feet away. There Grigsby stood, proud as Lucifer, and swinging a bottle of liquor over his head, swore he was the big buck of the lick. If anyone doubts it, he shouted, he has only to come on and wet his horns. A general engagement followed this challenge, but at the end of hostilities the field was cleared and the wounded retired amid the exultant shouts of their victors. Withdrew the colt. Mr. Alcott of Elgin, Illinois, tells of seeing Mr. Lincoln coming away from church unusually early one Sunday morning. The sermon could not have been more than halfway through, says Mr. Alcott. Tad was hung across his left arm like a pair of saddlebags, and Mr. Lincoln was striding along with long, deliberate steps toward his home. On one of the street corners he encountered a group of his fellow townsmen. Mr. Lincoln anticipated the question which was about to be put by the group, and, taking his figure of speech from practices with which they were only too familiar, said, "Gentlemen, I entered this colt, but he kicked around so I had to withdraw him." Sweet but mild revenge. When the United States found that a war with Black Hawk could not be dodged, Governor Reynolds of Illinois issued a call for volunteers, and among the companies that immediately responded was one from Menard County, Illinois. Many of these volunteers were from New Salem and Clary's Grove, and Lincoln, being out of business, was the first to enlist. The company being full, the men held a meeting at Richland for the election of officers. Lincoln had won many hearts, and they told him that he must be their captain. It was an office to which he did not aspire, and for which he felt he had no special fitness, but he finally consented to be a candidate. There was but one other candidate, a Mr. Kirkpatrick, who was one of the most influential men of the region. Previously, Kirkpatrick had been an employer of Lincoln, and was so overbearing in his treatment of the young man that the latter left him. The simple mode of electing a captain adopted by the company was by placing the candidates apart, and telling the men to go and stand with the one they preferred. Lincoln and his competitor took their positions, and then the word was given. At least 3 out of every 4 went to Lincoln at once. When it was seen by those who had arranged themselves with the other candidate that Lincoln was the choice of the majority of the company, they left their places, one by one, and came over to the successful side, until Lincoln's opponent in the friendly strife was left standing almost alone. "I felt badly to see him cut so," says a witness of the scene. Here was an opportunity for revenge. The humble laborer was his employer's captain, but the opportunity was never improved. Mr. Lincoln frequently confessed that no subsequent success of his life had given him half the satisfaction that this election did. Catch 'em and cheat 'em. The lawyers on the circuit traveled by Lincoln got together one night and tried him on the charge of accepting fees which tended to lower the established rates. It was the understood rule that a lawyer should accept all the client could be induced to pay. The tribunal was known as the Augmentatorial Court. Ward Layman, his law partner at the time, tells about it. Lincoln was found guilty and fined for his awful crime against the pockets of his brethren of the bar. The fine he paid with great good humor, and then kept the crowd of lawyers in uproarious laughter until after midnight. He persisted in his revolt, however, declaring that with his consent his firm should never, during its life or after its dissolution, deserve the reputation enjoyed by those shining lights of the profession, catch 'em and cheat 'em. A juryman's scorn. Lincoln had assisted in the prosecution of a man who had robbed his neighbor's hen roosts. Jogging home along the highway with the foreman of the jury that had convicted the hen stealer, he was complimented by Lincoln on the zeal and ability of the prosecution, and remarked, "Why, when the country was young, and I was stronger than I am now, I didn't mind packing off a sheep now and again, but stealing hens?" The good man's scorn could not find words to express his opinion of a man who would steal hens. Tad introduces our friends. President Lincoln often avoided interviews with delegations representing various states, especially when he knew the objects of their errands and was aware he could not grant their requests. This was the case with several commissioners from Kentucky, who were put off from day to day. They were about to give up in despair, and were leaving the White House lobby, their speech being interspersed with vehement and uncomplimentary terms concerning Old Abe, when Tad happened along. He caught at these words, and asked one of them if they wanted to see Old Abe, laughing at the same time. "Yes," he replied. "Wait a minute," said Tad, and rushed into his father's office. Said he, "Papa, may I introduce some friends to you?" His father, always indulgent and ready to make him happy, kindly said, "Yes, my son, I will see your friends." Tad went to the Kentuckians again and asked a very dignified-looking gentleman of the party his name. He was told his name. He then said, "Come, gentlemen," and they followed him. Leading them up to the president, Tad, with much dignity, said, "Papa, let me introduce you to Judge Blank of Kentucky," and quickly added, "Now, Judge, you introduce the other gentlemen." The introductions were gone through with, and they turned out to be the gentlemen Mr. Lincoln had been avoiding for a week. Mr. Lincoln reached for the boy, took him in his lap, kissed him, and told him it was all right, and that he had introduced his friend like a little gentleman as he was. Tad was 11 years old at this time. The president was pleased with Tad's diplomacy, and often laughed at the incident as he told others of it. One day, while caressing the boy, he asked him why he called those gentlemen his friends. "Well," said Tad, "I had seen them so often, and they looked so good and sorry, and said they were from Kentucky, that I thought they must be our friends." "That is right, my son," said Mr. Lincoln. "I would have the whole human race your friends and mine, if it were possible." Stood up the longest. There was a rough gallantry among the young people, and Lincoln's old comrades and friends in Indiana have left many tales of how he went to see the girls, of how he brought in the biggest back log and made the brightest fire, of how the young people, sitting around it, watching the way the sparks flew, told their fortunes. He helped pare apples, shell corn, and crack nuts. He took the girls to meeting and to spelling school, though he was not often allowed to take part in the spelling match, for the one who chose first always chose Abe Lincoln, and that was equivalent to winning, as the others knew that he would stand up the longest. Admired the strong man. Governor Hoyt of Wisconsin tells the story of Mr. Lincoln's great admiration for physical strength. Mr. Lincoln, in 1859, made a speech at the Wisconsin State Agricultural Fair. After the speech, in company with the governor, he strolled about the grounds, looking at the exhibits. They came to a place where a professional strong man was tossing cannonballs in the air, and catching them on his arms, and juggling with them as though they were as light as baseballs. Mr. Lincoln had never before seen such an exhibition, and he was greatly surprised and interested. When the performance was over, Governor Hoyt, seeing Mr. Lincoln's interest, asked him to go up and be introduced to the athlete. He did so, and as he stood looking down musingly on the man, who was very short, and evidently wondering that one so much smaller than he could be so much stronger, he suddenly broke out with one of his quaint speeches. "Why," he said, "why, I could lick salt off the top of your hat." Saved Lincoln's life. When Mr. Lincoln was quite a small boy, he met with an accident that almost cost him his life. He was saved by Austin Gollaher, a young playmate. Mr. Gollaher lived to be more than 90 years of age, and to the day of his death related with great pride his boyhood association with Lincoln. "Yes," Mr. Gollaher once said, "the story that I once saved Abraham Lincoln's life is true. He and I had been going to school together for a year or more, and had become greatly attached to each other. Then school disbanded on account of there being so few scholars, and we did not see each other much for a long while. One Sunday my mother visited the Lincolns, and I was taken along. Abe and I played around all day. Finally, we concluded to cross the creek to hunt for some partridges young Lincoln had seen the day before. The creek was swollen by a recent rain, and in crossing on the narrow footlog, Abe fell in. Neither of us could swim. I got a long pole and held it out to Abe, who grabbed it. Then I pulled him ashore. He was almost dead, and I was badly scared. I rolled and pounded him in good earnest. Then I got him by the arms and shook him, the water meanwhile pouring out of his mouth. By this means I succeeded in bringing him to, and he was soon all right. Then a new difficulty confronted us. If our mothers discovered our wet clothes, they would whip us. This we dreaded from experience, and determined to avoid. It was June, the sun was very warm, and we soon dried our clothing by spreading it on the rocks about us. We promised never to tell the story, and I never did until after Lincoln's tragic end. Would blow them to H. Mr. Lincoln had advised Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, commanding the United States Army, of the threats of violence on Inauguration Day, 1861. General Scott was sick in bed at Washington when Adjutant General Thomas Mather of Illinois called upon him in President-elect Lincoln's behalf, and the veteran commander was much wrought up. Said he to General Mather, "Present my compliments to Mr. Lincoln when you return to Springfield, and tell him I expect him to come on to Washington as soon as he is ready. Say to him that I will look after those Maryland and Virginia Rangers myself. I will plant cannon at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, and if any of them show their heads or raise a finger, I'll blow them to H. I can stand it if they can. United States Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio, Henry Winter Davis of Maryland, and Wendell Phillips were strongly opposed to President Lincoln's re-election, and Wade and Davis issued a manifesto. Phillips made several warm speeches against Lincoln and his policy. When asked if he had read the manifesto or any of Phillips' speeches, the president replied, "I have not seen them, nor do I care to see them. I have seen enough to satisfy me that I am a failure, not only in the opinion of the people in rebellion, but of many distinguished politicians of my own party. But time will show whether I am right or they are right, and I am content to abide its decision. I have enough to look after without giving much of my time to the consideration of the subject of who shall be my successor in office. The position is not an easy one, and the occupant, whoever he may be, for the next 4 years, will have little leisure to pluck a thorn or plant a rose in his own pathway." It was urged that this opposition must be embarrassing to his administration, as well as damaging to the party. He replied, "Yes, that is true. But our friends Wade, Davis, Phillips, and others are hard to please. I am not capable of doing so. I cannot please them without wantonly violating not only my oath, but the most vital principles upon which our government was founded. As to those who, like Wade and the rest, see fit to depreciate my policy and cavil at my official acts, I shall not complain of them. I accord them the utmost freedom of speech and liberty of the press, but shall not change the policy I have adopted in the full belief that I am right. I feel on this subject as an old Illinois farmer once expressed himself while eating cheese. He was interrupted in the midst of his repast by the entrance of his son, who exclaimed, "Hold on, Dad, there's skippers in that cheese you're eating." "Never mind, Tom," said he, as he kept on munching his cheese. "If they can stand it, I can." A mortifying experience. A lady reader or elocutionist came to Springfield in 1857. A large crowd greeted her. Among other things, she recited "Nothing to Wear," a piece in which is described the perplexities that beset Miss Flora McFlimsey in her efforts to appear fashionable. In the midst of one stanza, in which no effort is made to say anything particularly amusing, and during the reading of which the audience manifested the most respectful silence and attention, someone in the rear seats burst out with a loud, coarse laugh, a sudden and explosive guffaw. It startled the speaker and audience, and kindled a storm of unsuppressed laughter and applause. Everybody looked back to ascertain the cause of the demonstration, and were greatly surprised to find that it was Mr. Lincoln. He blushed and squirmed with the awkward diffidence of a schoolboy. What caused him to laugh no one was able to explain. He was doubtless wrapped up in a brown study, and recalling some amusing episode indulged in laughter without realizing his surroundings. The experience mortified him greatly. Grant held on all the time. Dispatch to General Grant, August 17, 1864. I have seen your dispatch expressing your unwillingness to break your hold where you are. Neither am I willing. hold on with a bulldog grip. Every little helped. As the time drew near at which Mr. Lincoln said he would issue the Emancipation Proclamation, some clergymen who feared the President might change his mind called on him to urge him to keep his promise. We were ushered into the cabinet room, says Dr. Sunderland. It was very dim, but one gas jet burning. As we entered, Mr. Lincoln was standing at the farther end of the long table, which filled the center of the room. As I stood by the door, I am so very short that I was obliged to look up to see the President. Mr. Robbins introduced me, and I began at once by saying, "I have come, Mr. President, to anticipate the new year with my respects, and if I may, to say to you a word about the serious condition of this country." "Go ahead, Doctor," replied the President. "Every little helps," but I was too much in earnest to laugh at his sally at my smallness. End of section 4.